Okay, so in this video, I am starting off from the previous one. So I have all these drawings already made in 2D in my Rhino file, and I have everything set up so I can go in and start to add line weights to this. Now, over in my layers panel, you can see I have a new layer called Make 2D. I have a set of visible lines, a set of clipping plane intersections, and a set of scene silhouettes. What I like to do is actually just make my own line weights and then gradually kind of move all the lines from what they are in the Make 2D to my set of lines that layers, I should say, that have line weights applied. So I'm going to go under Make 2D and I'll make a new sublayer. So that's a member of the Make 2D family, and I just like label them, whatever line weight I give them. And I do like to give them different colors so it's easier to tell the difference. And let's see, I don't know, like 3 or 4 here. Probably only need like 3, but and then we probably want a dashed line. Didn't mean to do that. And we're also going to make a layer. Well, we'll do that later. So yeah, I'm going to apply different colors to these. I just kind of go down the list. Okay. And then I'm also just going to set up my print properties right now. So I'll select all those layers by holding Shift on the keyboard. Click on the little diamond, which is the color that it's going to print to. So even though I can see it displayed in different colors, it'll print black. And then I'm going to go ahead and set the line weights to whatever it is that I wrote down. I can always adjust those later, but we'll use this as a starting point. Oops. This one the same. And for our dash line, we would go to line type where it says continuous, change it like the hidden one. Click on that. All right, so now we can go through and just start to assign layers to all the existing lines we have in our drawings. And I like to start by going under our visible. So most of our lines are there. If I go to select objects, and I'm just going to put that on the lightest, maybe the second lightest line. Most of our lines are going to end up on that layer anyway. And then I would do the same for my clipping plane intersections. Now remember, any kind of cut on a plane or section is our heaviest line weight. So I would go ahead and change that to my heaviest line weight. And then my scene silhouette, I could do the same, or I could maybe put it on do this one. Okay. And so we're starting from there. Now, I forgot to make scene silhouettes for these guys. I could obviously just do it right now. But there's another really quick trick that you can use, and I'll show you right now. If you want to make a scene silhouette for an Axon drawing that already exists, so I would type in rectangle, make a rectangle around my whole drawing, select everything and type in hatch. And then when the hatch panel opens, I want to select this option boundary, which allows me to click in areas that I want hatched. So I would select the space between the rectangle and the drawing, press enter. I'm going to set it to solid, click OK. And then I'll select the hatch I've just created and type in dupe border. And that should actually give me the outline of the hatch, the inside and the outside. So I've just created a new line. And I'll type in select last, which should select those same lines that I just created. And I'll put those on 0.45. So I've created a silhouette line for those. I actually could have also just copied them from this, I just realized, but do that. Okay. So, and then in here, like in your Make 2D, you'll find that sometimes there's a few little missing pieces here and there. I want to add those. Pretty good, like this one. Is there 2 lines there? No. All right, the rest looks pretty good. Oh, sorry. Okay. And then for this, so one of the things you want to think about in drawing these things in plans and in sections is whether or not we're distinguishing between what's an edge or kind of a corner between things or in the face of things. In other words, when I'm looking at the side of the stool like this, that's a corner, right? And that's a corner, and that's a corner. But that is like a joint. It's part of the joint, but we're seeing that that's in the face, right, of that member in essence, right? In other words, when we look at it from the side. So this is kind of a corner, and those are edges, but they're in the plane of that, side of the stool frame. So that would mean like those are things that we want to be a lighter line. Now, I actually like to do this thing. I'll set my current layer to whatever I want to add things to. And then I use the command change to current. And you can see it autocompletes, so you don't have to type the whole thing. So I just go in there and then I press enter, right, to repeat the last command. And yeah, this one I didn't do, but change to current. So again, anytime you have an edge that's kind of like on a face, these you might even be able to explode. Oh yeah, okay. And you could also do the same for like receding corners rather than protruding corners, but I'm not going to bother with that. Right? That one, for example, you'd have to split that line to get it to be just the segment you want on a lighter line weight. All right, so we'll do that again for these two down here. Yeah. Slightly quicker way. Change to current. Okay, so that looks pretty good. These are also lighter. So this is the outside outline of our dimensions. We might want to keep that just so we can kind of show in what the size is, but I'll put it on a dashed line to show it's not like really geometry or anything. And then to do so actually you could do the same thing with line weights here. Receding lines should be lighter, right? Receding corners, protruding corners. Which there's fortunately not that many. Pretty good. Okay. Great. All right. And then to do the connection details. So these ones, we'll use a few more line weights on. I'm going to make all my zigzag lines the lightest line weight. I'm going to make so again, the stuff you're cutting through, you kind of want it to be heavier. The rules are a little bit different for connection details just because there can sometimes be so much detail that it gets hard to read. Like for example, if I were to start to make like that outline, the heaviest line weight, it might like start to disappear on me, right? But yeah, for the most part, I didn't actually quite finish this drawing. I'm going to trim away some of this other stuff that you wouldn't see. Pretty good. Okay. So like that, I could even maybe switch to a lighter line. I wanted to. Maybe this too. We'll see how it looks when we put it on the layout. But the other thing that you want to add in particular to your connection details is hatch patterns. Because one of the things that's really valuable on a set of shop drawings is to identify different materials. And in this case, also grain orientation. So I've put on D2L in our course website under resources, 2 files. One of them is called hatches. If you download that file, and all you got to do is like drag it into your Rhino file. So I'm just dragging it in from the file browser, and I'm going to click import. Don't click open. Right? And you should find that a couple new hatches, objects with different hatch patterns, have appeared in your Rhino file. Now, I will also point out, and they'll automatically appear on a layer called hatch, which is something that you want to have as well as a separate layer, and I'll give it a separate color as well. Okay, and so now we're going to go through and like hatch all this stuff. So I would do it the same way as I did on actually making that profile line before. I would use the option boundary. So then I could click in certain areas. I'll click in those two areas, for example, and I'll go down. So you should be able to scroll down. If you can't quite see the pattern, just look for the name, and then it'll give me a preview of what it looks like there. So that's my wood, right? Click OK. Now I forgot to set this layer to current before I started doing my hatch, but I'll just move it over to that hatch layer. Then I could hatch this piece as well, right? And that one, maybe we want to rotate it 45 degrees to indicate, oops, I'm sorry, not 45 degrees. Rotate it vertical or something like that. And we could even change the scale of it to indicate that it's a different piece, kind of wood or something like that. All right, and so same thing goes for this detail. I would hatch this piece first. Okay, and then I would do this one. I would show that they're at different orientation. Okay. Those are actually the same orientation, and then this would be, and we'd make that maybe lighter or smaller scale. There we go. And then finally, I could also, so the typical hatch pattern for wood, we can use that like a wood grain pattern. This is a typical hatch pattern for steel. So 45 degrees double line. This is pretty typical for concrete. It's kind of gravelly with the crazy triangles. We're not going to use any of them, but they're there if you intend to indicate any of those materials. And I would actually also do my threads on my screw here just to indicate that that is a screw. And I'm just going to use hatch 1, which is a default Rhino hatch. I'm going to rotate it to like 15 degrees. And then I'll make the scale a little bit smaller. Let's try like 0.25, maybe like 0.25. Anyway, just to show that there's like a thread. And again, that helps identify what that thing is. Okay, great. So now we've added line weights to all of our drawings. And the other thing that we want to start to do is to think about how they're going to be organized on the page. For instance, I might want to align some drawings. Like this is a top view. Maybe I want to align it to my elevation view here, if that's going to be how it's laid out on the page. So I would just snap there. We could copy this. 100% no. Yeah, so we'd center it like that. And that would allow me to line that up, and then I could move this. So by the way, I'm just holding shift and then tapping tab on the keyboard. And then I'm locked in again to that certain direction I'm moving. And these should be lined up, I think. There. Okay, great. So you can also actually draw lines between them, basically construction lines, right? To indicate that like this is that and so on, just to help people understand. You probably want to do that with your lightest line weight. I should say that if you are going to do that, you would probably want to scale up all your line weights, right? So you'd want this to be lighter than that line, for example. So you could take all these lines, let's see, these lines. So we would just step everything up. Yeah. And we could even like draw here, on a dashed line, where the seat would be relative to that top. And it does matter actually where these go. Over the dashed line, because you'll see that. All right. Cool. So I think we're good to go. Now, the other thing that we're going to add is, let me put some here, dimensions. And one of the, kind of important part about this type of drawing is to figure out where to dimension what, right? We don't need to show every single dimension on every single drawing because that's going to be overwhelming and hard to read. Now, the first thing that I'll do is make a new layer to draw my dimensions on. I'll choose the new layer button. I'll call it dim, D-I-M. I'll set it to current, and I'm going to give it a different color so I can tell what it is. And then I'm going to go ahead and type in dimension, just the command dimension. And on this guy, first thing I'll do is I'll click where it says annotation style. And you can see from the drop-down, I don't know if this will show up immediately for you or not, but foot-inch architectural is a really good one for what we're going to do. So I'll change to that. Now let's say, for instance, I wanted to dimension, the width of the stool in this direction. So I'll click in two places and I'll drag it down. Now you can see that dimension is enormous. I would want to edit that dimension. Now, before I get to that, let me just make sure that, if you don't see foot-inch architectural show up, here's the way to get it show up. If you type in options, go to annotation styles, and if you don't see it in that list, you'll just click new, and it's one of the ones that's in this list. So it should show up for you right there. If it didn't show up in that list, you would just click it and click OK, and then it will be there. And so when you type in dimension, you want to change the annotation style to that. Now, back to the point I was making just a second ago, this is obviously massive, right? Now, if I select a particular dimension and go to properties, and then go to the button at the top that looks like a little dimension, I can change the properties of that dimension. And I could make it smaller, obviously. But what I actually want to do is I want to change what's called the model space scale. So when you're editing a dimension, what you're actually editing, or what you're actually going to see on the page, is this dimension. So that's the height of my text, for example, is 1/8 of an inch, which is actually quite small on the paper. And we can see all these things about like the margin. So what we're seeing in our model space is actually 96 times larger than what it'll show up on the page. So just to demonstrate that, I could make a new layout, go to new layout, and go to write a PDF, 11 by 17, landscape, and click OK. And so you can see there, it looks quite civilized, right? It looks pretty normal. So the way we want to change this is just by changing the model space scale. Now, I could change it for this one dimension, which would make it smaller, but then I'd have to do that every single time I made a new dimension, which I don't want to do. That's a lot of wasted time. So I would select that dimension, and instead of editing just for the one dimension, I would go to edit style. And then I can basically change the settings for this whole annotation style. And I think I don't know what's going to make sense. Maybe let's try 10. I can click apply. So that looks pretty similar to what we'll see on the page. And that is kind of what I want. Maybe even a little smaller. I don't know, 5 or something. Because again, like the extension lines are going to matter too. So now if I were to delete this and type in dim again, I could snap to those 2 points and I could see that. So that's going to make sense for when I put it on my layout. And so I think I actually messed up. But the nice thing about, so I would go through and like an elevation, for example, is a great place to call out the overall height of the stool. And the top view is obviously a good place to call out the overall dimensions of the seat of the stool. And I want to kind of also be mindful of how far I'm extending them out from the drawing, right? You can see with that one, I actually matched that one because I want to just keep things aligned and clean and everything like that. Like you could go in here and start to dimension like the overall depth of the seat, for example. Anyway, if you wanted to dimension something, so the dimension command will really only do ortho. So like if I wanted to know that, I don't really have a good example of where this would make sense, but if I wanted to snap to this and this and know what dimension it is that way and that way, that's what the command dimension will do. If I, however, wanted to know the dimension diagonally, I could use the command dim aligned. and I could snap to those 2 points, and I can actually pull off a dimension line perpendicular to those 2 points I selected and set the dimension for that. Yeah, so I'm actually not going to do that there, right? I would do that I'm going to do that over there. So on the exploded axon, we don't really need to add any dimensions. On the cut sheet, we do, right? So this is exactly where we would want to say, okay, the cutout of that joint is 1.5 by 3/4, right? Now, let's see if it actually works. So I'm going to use dim aligned in this case. And yeah, so there we go. And so the only trick with this really is just getting them in a way that's going to not be visually hard to read, But we would dimension everything there. Okay. I need to move that there. And you'll see again, like when we go to the layout, it's going to look a little different, right? Because we're going to be much more zoomed in on that drawing, so we would see it more like that. Now, there's a thing called dimension tolerance, I should point out. So if I click on this dimension line, again, over here on the right, all the way at the bottom, it says tolerance. And so with our, oh, actually, I'm sorry, it's not under tolerance, it's under length units. But essentially, it's going to only display a dimension rounded to a certain, increment. So under length units, you can see our linear resolution is 1/4 inch. So no matter what, if I drew a line that was a 1/16 of an inch, actually, I think it'll dimension that as 0, and then try to dimension it. It'll tell me it's 0, right? So it's going to round every increment to a dimension, around every dimension to an increment of 1/4 inch. So we don't, in this case, we know that these are all correct dimensions. Actually, this one's not, right? That should be 3/4. So there's something to look at for right there. But if you want to change again the tolerance, rather than changing it just for 1, although you could do it just for 1, if you wanted to just change 1 and you were happy with everything else, I would go to Edit Style. So yeah, because it's an axon, certain edges are foreshortened, right? So that line may in fact be 1/2 inch, although we know in reality that it should be cut at 3/4, right? So we would go to, we would go to length units just like we did before, and we could change this to like a smaller. So there you can see it's actually giving us numbers that are not what we want them to show. So I'm just going to hit undo on that. But if you do need to change it to a smaller increment, we can do that. Now, if I wanted to dimension this guy so that it's properly dimensioned, oh, I just used the dimension. So I'd use dim aligned. I can also just click on it, and over here where it says, like, if you're editing a text bubble, for example, I can just type in whatever dimension I want. So just make sure you're right, Anyway, so there's 3/4. And so it'll show that way in our drawing. Okay, so you want to dimension all the, like the small scale, like I'm not going to dimension that joint on these drawings, but I would do it on here, right? The cut sheet is intended for fabricating each of the pieces. If I don't know this project and I'm going to go start making it, I want to basically I want to know, well, what do I have to cut this overall piece to? How big is that cutout, right? What's the distance of that cutout from the end of the piece, right? I would want to also dimension like this, right? What's the distance between, or where it starts and ends, one of those two things. So you'd want to kind of basically give someone all the information they would need to know to cut all those joints, how big they are and where they're located along the length of the piece, right? So we would also want to give it the overall dimensions there. that. Okay, and then the other thing I'll point out is if you do end up with something that's kind of more messy like this, you can actually also explode a dimension. Explode. Now, again, this is just a text bubble, right? It's just a text box. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, if you put your fractions in square brackets, it'll make them like stacked. I think I did that wrong. It shows you how that works here. Oh, you got a double square brackets. We'll do it. All right. There we go. So now, if I wanted to change, like if I wanted to orient this, for example, I could go turn all the control points on for all this stuff, and then I would move it. So it's like orient to. All right, I'm trying to get my post. Smart track to work. Don't need that to be smart track. There we go. That it would be straight up and down and oriented to a thing. But then again, you'd have to edit the dimension as well to make sure it's actually showing the right, distance that you want it to be showing. Normally, again, you would do a cut sheet that is either like an elevation or a plan of that part, which makes it quite a lot simpler to draw, right? Because then the dimensions are the dimensions. But in any case, that's how you would go through with these guys if they're in an axon. And then we want to do the same for all of this, right? So we want to know how big is this, how big is that. Again, these might show up better once they're on the page. We have to check because we're going to be more zoomed in. Remember when we do our connection details? Having trouble finding them. There they are. Okay, yeah. So that looks much more normal, right, on the page in the layout. Yeah. Okay. So that's line weights and dimensions. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to do the layouts, labels, and annotations.